Right in the early hours of the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli side acknowledged this war was nothing they prepared for. Intelligence blunders and short-sighted leadership led the Israeli army to the brink of defeat. While the Syrian and Egyptian army were held back at the first days, it became clear that the Soviet superpower is heavily involved both materially and politically in the war, and therefore Israel must have some kind of backing from the US if it wishes to fend off the attack or even to survive. During the late 60s and in the early 70s, the Soviet Union and the USA practiced a policy called the détente, a policy that was meant to ease the tension between the East and the West. This was by no means peace or even regulating the relationship, as both sides kept on fighting viciously on the world stage for influence through client states building deterrent weapons and technology and conducting proxy wars all over the globe. In short, by a series of treaties, the détente was meant only to lower the risk of an escalating tension resulting in an all-out nuclear war. Before the Six Days War in 1967, Israel and the US had a very superficial relationship. For example, Israel did not have even one American jet fighter before 1967. The weapon embargo that the French President Charles de Gaulle announced days before the 1967 war and the heavy Soviet involvement in the region left the door open for the US to gain influence and prestige in the Middle East. The United States' interests in the region were contradictory, if not schizophrenic. They had to keep the ever-growing Soviet influence out of the oil-rich Middle East while keeping happy the West-leaning Arab states like Jordan and Saudi Arabia. To add to the hardship, the US energy consumption had peaked during the early 70s, well beyond the local US oil production capacity. This was understood by everyone on the world stage as a strategic chink in the superpower shining armor. For Secretary of State Dr. Henry Kissinger, perhaps the key figure of this story, Israel was an important pawn in the game of gaining influence and power in the region. By strengthening the relationship with Israel, he could gain access to Arab capitals, promising to subdue their fears from Israel. By siding with the winners, the US would achieve proof that US weapons, technology, and might is superior to the Soviet Union. And so Henry Kissinger went on the job. On the 6th of October, Saturday morning, Golda Meir, Israeli Prime Minister at the time, called Kissinger and told him Israel knows for a fact that Egypt and Syria are about to launch an all-out war on Israel. She wanted to know how would the White House feel if Israel will employ a preemptive strike. Kissinger made her realize that Washington will not approve such action and will see Israel as the aggressor. For all her faults, Meir, who grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, understood the threats behind the seemingly polite answer and just how serious Kissinger was. Consequently, she rejected endless pledges from her generals to do something in the short hours before the war would break. Later, in a few interviews, Kissinger said, "If Israel would have struck first, they would not have gotten from us as much as a nail." By day 6 into the war, despite endless requests from Israel and promises from the State Department and President Nixon, not even one crate was sent to Israel on an American plane. James Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense at the time, who was born and raised as a Jew and converted to the Lutheran faith later in his life, refused even to meet with Israeli delegates. And Kissinger kept reiterating that his hands are tied by the Pentagon, who would not risk a rupture with the oil-rich Arab world. This version of events was contested by high-level officials and generals in the U.S. Armed Forces. Elmo Zumwalt, Chief of Naval Operations at the time, wrote in his book that it was Kissinger who held back and detained U.S. supply to Israel, in hope that Israel's bleeding will turn it more dependent on the U.S. and the Pax Americana he envisioned. Whatever the reasons were, in the first week of the war, Israel had to make do with what it had. At the 12th of October, Kissinger described the situation in the Middle East thus: Israel advanced into Syria some distance. Egyptian forces are holding 6 to 10 miles on the east of the Suez Canal. In the south, the front is stable. In the north, the situation is fluid. This was an accurate description of the war at the time. Egypt had a stronghold on the east side of the Suez Canal and was unlikely to progress any further, as it would mean facing organized Israeli forces, who were monitoring Egyptian movement from the higher ground. And more importantly, it would make the Egyptians lose their anti-aircraft protection. At the North Front, Israel faced on the 12th of October the first tank from the two Iraqi expeditionary divisions. So why was the airlift so important to Israel? And why, despite the risk of an oil embargo, the US committed to the largest airlift the world had ever seen to those days? The Soviets were deeply worried from the IDF advancement into Syrian front. By the 10th of October, Antonov 12 and Antonov 22 cargo planes started landing at airports around Damascus and Cairo. Cargo ships with tanks and ammunition left Eastern Europe heading to the war zones. This took Washington by surprise. Kissinger assumed until that point that the Soviet Union will practice a superpower responsibility and will refrain from large-scale shipments in order to force the different side of the conflict to cease fire and negotiate. Kissinger almost immediately tried to contact Kosygin, Prime Minister of the Soviet Union, in order to de-escalate the situation, but to no avail. If anything, by the 12th of October, CIA intelligence learned that 3 Soviet divisions in Hungary were being stripped from tanks and equipment to be subsequently shipped to the Middle East. It is important to remember that at the time no one could estimate how deep the USSR involvement will be. If, for any reason, Soviet soldiers were to man the tank shipped to the region, it would mean a new dangerous threshold in the conflict which no one in Washington wanted or prepared for. The Soviet lack of cooperation or even deceit rang alarm bells all over Washington. What was thought at the time by the US as a practicing responsible restraint on their part turned out to be perceived as an act of weakness in Moscow. Late evening 12th of October, Schlesinger informed Kissinger that no commercial airline are willing to participate in the shipment in the Middle East in fear of Arab retribution. A decision was made to use US Army aircraft. Those SOBs understand only power, said Kissinger to Schlesinger. After Vietnam and in the height of the Watergate scandal, it was becoming clear that Moscow decided that the US have a very marginal room for maneuvers and will refrain from intervening wholeheartedly. This was a gross misjudgment by the Soviets. On the evening of the 12th, President Nixon, Kissinger, and Schlesinger met in the Oval Office. No one knows exactly what was said on that meeting. However, leaks and rumors suggested that Kissinger explained that the State Department estimates the USSR is going for the kill, exploiting what they see as an American weakness and lack of resolve. Schlesinger, on the other hand, advocated for caution and was reluctant to offer any major commitment by the USA. This account was denied by both Kissinger and Schlesinger. However, what we do know for a fact is that Nixon, who said, "I'm tired of this and that," sent there everything that could fly. Of course, we are left to ask, if there was no argument, why was President Nixon tired of this and that? Now that decision has been made, it was time for the US Army to flex its might. Within hours, C-5 and C-141 planes were ready to deliver cargo from the East Coast to Israel. However, as it turned out, without refueling port, the American planes could only carry a small amount of cargo. Once again, it was for Kissinger to make phone calls and get permission from the western states of Europe to refuel the American airplanes on their territory. Fearing retribution and oil embargo, not even one Western country agreed for any refueling arrangement or even permission for US planes to go over their respective airspace. Another problem was access to US bases and warehouses in Germany. Kissinger called the German Chancellor at the time and informed him of American Army aircraft will be soon land on their bases in Germany to load ammunition and equipment. To his surprise, the German Chancellor opposed this idea. When Kissinger politely reminded him that the bases are American territory and the equipment is American equipment stored exactly for this kind of crisis, the West Germany Chancellor Willy Brandt threatened to park trucks on the American runways. Kissinger, himself a German refugee who fled Germany in the 1930s, decided he can do without a scandal. Finally, after immense pressure from Nixon and Kissinger, Portugal agreed for US aircraft to use the Lajes air base in the Azores Island. At the time, it was a small air base, susceptible to winds and short of adequate structure to accommodate such operation. I just cannot impress upon you the weak reed we are leaning on, said General Carlton, MAC commander, to James Schlesinger. While urgent attempts were made to find a solution, the U.S. Navy has geared up to secure a safe passage for the U.S. cargo planes. The flight carrier Iwo Jima was ordered to leave South Carolina and head for the Atlantic. Another flight carrier, Franklin Roosevelt, left Barcelona and headed for the region. Within 2 days, U.S. Navy Sixth Fleet was deployed in the Mediterranean Sea, securing safe passage for the U.S. aircraft. Considering there was no draw plan for such an event, the U.S. achievement was nothing short of impressive. Equipment and ammunition had to be collected from 29 points across the U.S. and reach the Azores in perfect timing, as the Lajes airport was too small to accommodate more than 2 aircraft an hour. 77 C-5s and 276 C-141 Starlifters were allocated to MAC. By the end of the war, MAC managed to unload in Israel 22,476 tons of ammunition and equipment in 569 sorties. This is twice the tonnage the Soviet airlifted to the region, in half the sorties, with 4 times the distance. The ability of the US to engage successfully in such operation became evident to everyone in the Middle East, or even in the world. In 2003, Robert Jordan, the US ambassador to Saudi Arabia, said in an interview that after the war, Prince Fahd, later to become king, gathered all his generals to show them footage of the 1973 airlift. At the end of the screening, he said to them, "This is why we need to maintain close relationship with the US. They are the only ones capable of saving us in this manner should we be ever at risk." Another advantage was the ability of Washington to restrain Israel. At the last days of the war, Kissinger used all his persuasive powers to save Egypt's Third Army from encirclement and annihilation. He even went as far as suggesting to Israel that it should permit free passage to the Third Army after the encirclement was complete. Dinitz, the Israeli ambassador to the US, asked Kissinger in return if he can recall another example from history of such an arrangement between fighting armies. Threatening the Israelis with everything he could, Kissinger managed to get the Egyptian Third Army a supply of food, medication, and most importantly water, so it would not collapse. The Soviet standoff. The civil unrest in the late 60s and early 70s across the US, along with the withdrawal from the Vietnam and Watergate scandal, made the Soviets assume the US will hesitate with new engagements in the world. This misjudgment backfired. The US retaliated to every act with greater resolve than the Soviets could have anticipated, until finally the Soviet Union backed down. The course of the war. This aspect is a tricky one. The Israeli Minister of Defense at the time, Moshe Dayan, and many others argued that the material help did not change the course of the war. The first plane from the US landed on the evening of the 12th of October, 7 days after fire broke out. It peaked at the 14th, 10 days before a ceasefire agreement has been reached. The jet fighters that were sent were quickly painted with IAF insignia and managed to make 200 sorties out of more than 12,000 that the IAF had made until the end of the war. Whatever the material help did or didn't achieve, there's one aspect which no one will argue against. By the 14th of October, counterattack by Syrian, Iraqi, and Jordanian forces in the north have failed. Wrongfully, the Soviets assumed that there is nothing to keep the IDF from encircling Damascus. Simultaneous attack by Egypt attempted to widen the bridgehead have fared no better. In one day, the Egyptian army lost some 200 tanks. Fearing collapse of its clients and subsequent humiliation, the Soviets pressed all the panic buttons.
We received a message from Brezhnev that if we did not jointly operate against the Israeli encirclement of the Third Egyptian Army, that the Soviet Union might be prepared to act alone, reinforced by the fact that 10 of the 12 paratroop or airborne divisions of the Soviet Union had stood down, which was its signal of preparation, and that some things had happened in the nuclear field that made us concerned.
10 other Army airborne divisions were put on red alert, and rhetoric escalated. Whatever the outcome of the war and how costly it would get, no one in Israel wanted to face the Soviet army. It was clear that a nation of 3.5 million will never stand a chance against the Soviet might. The resolve of the USA manifested in the massive airlift and later by deploying the Sixth Fleet and declaring DEFCON 3 held back any Soviet thoughts of directly interfering in the war. Psychological and moral effect. It is hard to calculate the psychological impact of the airlift on the Israelis at the time. An endless stream of casualties and grim reports from the front, along with Soviet air and sea shipment, casted a dark shadow on Israel's sky. Soviet rhetoric of physically interfering in the war made even level-headed generals quietly discuss the Masada option, a code name for using the ultimate weapon if Israel would need to face the Red Army. So instead of trying to assess the moral boost, I will here tell a story I read in many places in my research of the subject. Although I couldn't authenticate it, like many other stories or urban legends, it is probably accurately reflects emotion rather than historical account. When the first C-5 engine rolled over Tel Aviv, an old man with a number tattooed to his hand stood in the middle of the street, tears running down his cheeks. When strangers approached him and asked if he's all right, his only reply was, "Once again, they are coming to save me."